Welcome to A House Divided. I'm Daniel Weinberg, and here we are at the Abraham Lincoln Bookshop in Chicago, as we always are. Before we go any further, I do want to, since Thanksgiving is coming up, I want to thank all of you on the behalf of our shop for the support that you all give us, not only sharing us on Facebook, but also purchasing books. Those allow us to bring in authors like today and keep these programs going and keep our doors open. So we're very grateful for that. Of course, this is today the 157th anniversary of the Gettysburg Address. Usually we'd be in Gettysburg with the Lincoln Forum, but not this year, hopefully next. That's not a bad place for everyone to be at some point. thelincolnforum.org. It's an organization all of you should be aware of and joining. So we're honored today to have David Reynolds with his latest book, Abraham Lincoln in His Times. It's a Penguin Press and $45. You're watching on live streaming broadcast on Facebook. And I have a book plate here. You can order the book right now, and there'll be a link on the comments page where you can also ask questions. You'll do that. This is the book plate that David was very generous in signing for us, and we'll have this in the book for you when you get it. I'll come back with questions during the broadcast, so please feel free to ask them. And now to our host, Bjorn Skaptason.
Thank you very much, Daniel. And welcome to A House Divided, David S. Reynolds. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Bjorn, very much, and Daniel. Much appreciated.
For the folks who are watching, let me introduce our author today. David S. Reynolds is an historian and a biographer. He is a distinguished professor at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. David is previously the author of John Brown, Abolitionist, Mightier Than the Sword, Uncle Tom's Cabin, and The Battle for America, Walt Whitman's America, which was the winner of the Bancroft Prize and the Ambassador Book Award. He's also the author of many other books and articles and more than I could list right here in very briefly. In addition to the Bancroft and the Ambassador Prizes, Dr. Reynolds holds the Christian Gauss Award and has been nominated for National Book Critics Circle Award for biography and autobiography. And so again, welcome to the program.
Wonderful to be here. Thank you for having me.
Now David, you describe Abraham Lincoln in His Times, as a cultural biography, and you describe yourself as a cultural biographer, cultural historian. I hope I get that right. Can you tell the folks, can you tell our customers what you mean by a cultural biography?
Sure. Well, there have been between 16,000 and 17,000 books written about Abraham Lincoln. Many of them are superb, wonderful books. But you can read book after book on Lincoln without hearing about Edgar Allan Poe, whose works he liked very much, or even about Petroleum Nasby, who he memorized at length, or about his favorite songs and his favorite poems. And a lot of the cultural phenomenon, some of it has been lost from view, but was quite important to him and helped to shape him, and also to amuse him and to shape him and influence him. And I differentiate between standard biography, which follows his life and maybe one or two contexts, like his political context, or compared with one other figure or something like that, to cultural biography, which tries to weave together the entire cultural background into the life story, almost like a tapestry, because it's based on the belief that we are all shaped by our immediate culture, our local culture, but also by the larger national culture as well. And even our innermost thoughts and impulses are influenced by the larger culture. Um, it becomes almost like what Emerson called the air surrounding us that seeps through the pores of our skin. And I try to create that air and show how it kind of seeped into Lincoln's skin. And talking about Emerson, Emerson's singled out Lincoln as the one great hero who spanned the entire realm of culture. From the very highest, he memorized Shakespeare by the page, even though he had less than 1 year of education. He also went through the 7 books of Euclid's geometry, all by himself, to kind of the very lowest, because he he liked bawdy humor and kind of dirty jokes and that kind of thing, and the kind of grotesque frontier humor of his day, and everything kind of in the middle. He loves sentimental songs. Who doesn't like sentimental songs? And yeah, I think everybody does. And his favorite was called 20 Years Ago, about going back to your childhood. And, you know, everything is kind of the same, but everything has changed. And it's a lovely song. But anyway, and he really did, as Emerson said, span the entire realm of culture until when he got down low, Emerson said, until the very dogs believed in him, you know. And it's that kind of Lincoln that frankly has been pretty much left out of most books on him. Occasionally,
I would agree with that. I mean, there have been some cultural histories, but I couldn't think of another book that you could call a cultural biography of.
Yeah. And that's the thing I tried to do. And it's not so much about his contemporary culture. It's much more about the kind of interweaving of that culture with his own character and his own life. So I always want to keep him and his life and his biography kind of as the skeleton around which the culture is sort of interwoven, so to speak.
Okay, yeah.
So that I don't, I mean, there are books on, the age in which Lincoln lived or something, and they'll go on and on for a couple of hundred pages about certain political debates going on, that kind of. This is not that kind of book. This kind of stays fairly closely to Lincoln, his personal experience, but as it intersects with his culture.
Right. Now, one thing that Daniel has already brought up, and I'm glad he did, is the Lincoln Forum. And a few years ago, a famous Hollywood director who can remain unnamed, but he may or may not have made a movie called Lincoln, called the folks at the Lincoln Forum and the folks like us that devour every Lincoln book. We want all 16,000 if we can. He called us Lincoln obsessives. Lincoln obsessives. And he wasn't wrong. He wasn't wrong about it. And I have to admit to you, from my point of view of the Lincoln obsessive, that as soon as the Penguin Press catalog came out, and I saw the title, Abe, I thought to myself, okay, how long into this book am I going to get, Reynolds, before we deal with the elephant in the room? And I was very happy to open the book to the first line of the preface on the first page and find that he liked to be called Lincoln, not Abe. So why the title? What does that mean, that he likes to be called Lincoln or Mr. Lincoln, but this book is called Abe?
Yeah, and it's kind of funny because, he didn't like to be called Abe, and those who were close to him, the lawyers, now let's put it this way, when he was growing up, his relatives would often call him Abe. But when he was a lawyer, for example, he really, even as president, he didn't like Mr. President. He didn't even like Mr. Lincoln, although Mary, his wife, would call him Mr. Lincoln. She kind of got away with it. Or father, or she would call him father. And he would call her Molly or Mary or sometimes mother. But, and yet, even though he didn't like the name, he knew that the moniker of Abe in its variations of Honest Abe, Old Abe, Uncle Abe, Abe the Illinois rail splitter. He knew that basically that's how the masses loved to refer to him. And he said, without the name Old Abe, I don't think I would have won the election of 1860. I really don't think I would have. He was known in popular culture as Abe. And I came up with that opening paragraph where I say he preferred to be called Lincoln, plain Lincoln. And then I give various, then I say he was Mr. Lincoln to blah, blah. He was Father Abraham, but to the masses, he was Abe. And I woke up one night at 3 a.m. and thought of the opening of Lolita. She was low, plain low in slacks in the morning. She was Dolores on the dotted line. She was Dolly in socks in school, but in my arms, she was always Lolita. And it's kind of crazy, but I said, why don't I do that with Abe? You know, sort of arrive at Abe. You know, he was this, he was that, and the other. So yeah.
Yeah, the dust jacket is telling us who that man is to us, not who he was to him in his own mind necessarily.
Right. Yeah.
Now, Daniel mentioned, and I'm glad he did, that today is the anniversary of the Gettysburg Address. And so let's not miss the opportunity to dig a little bit deeper on the Gettysburg Address and how that plays into to Lincoln and culture. Let me see. The Gettysburg Address is a permanent part of our culture, but it also existed within the culture of 1863. It meant something to them. Can you give us a couple of the cultural touchstones that Lincoln evoked in the address? You know, for instance, when he said 7 years ago, everybody listening to him would have gone, aha.
Yeah, there's in a previous version off the cuff, it said 87 years ago, but to some serenaders outside. But he wanted to have the resonance of the Bible. There's there's a phrase in the Bible that's very similar to that. I think in the Bible it's 70 years ago or something like that, but it was a very biblical kind of thing. It had been actually used before by anti-slavery people, that kind of 70 thing. And it gave it a certain resonance, biblical resonance. And when he says our fathers, founded on this continent, the word continent was a kind of post-human meaning using the physical earth as, or something physical outside. Right now we're determined by post-humanism because we're not with each other. We're determined by a thing called COVID. A thing is determining our lives. And the earth, when he says the continent, that was his way of using the earth as his affirmation of union. Hey, we're all together. We're not North and South. Even though he was in the middle of the Civil War, he was always affirming unity and union. So the continent really helped him to that. And then with the proposition, and in a way that comes from Euclid, he memorized all the Euclidean geometric propositions. I think there were 157 of them, a lot of them showing about equality, the equality of angles in a parallel, in a square, for example, or in a rectangle, that kind of thing. A lot of it was about equality. So the proposition that all men are created equal, and that brings right in the first sentence the Declaration of Independence, and in a way boils down all of America to that one single concept of human equality. And the Republican Party had done that. Back then, the Republicans were what we would call the liberals, and the Democrats were what we would call the conservatives. Anyway, but they had put the Declaration of Independence as human equality into their 1856 and 1860 platforms, but he puts it right in the first sentence there. So he brings together the Bible, the founding fathers, the earth, the continent, and then that proclamation of human equality in the very, very first sentence. And then toward the end, when he says a government, of the people, for the people, and by the people, there had been 12 usages of that phrase, but he makes it very rhythmic. It had been used by Theodore Parker in a sermon that he was well aware of. It had been used by Daniel Webster, but they kind of made it much bumpier, and he made it very rhythmic and trochaic and everything. So there was that resonance there as well. So yeah, he's quite often drawing from his contemporary culture. And as we know, the other speaker that day who had preceded him, Edward Everett, had gone on for over 2 hours and had really meandered all over the place. But in about 2.5 minutes, in a speech that was well under 300 words, Lincoln really boiled down the meaning of America into such a beautiful, poetic, and very concise speech. And afterwards, Everett said, you said more in your 2 minutes than, yeah, you beat,
said 2 hours.
You beat me today.
Exactly.
He knew it. He knew it.
But then, and then Lincoln was not afraid in what he intended to be a statement of national purpose. He was not afraid to get a little bit earthy, a little bit raw. He thought that was part of who we were. For instance, when he's talking about founding fathers conceiving in liberty, bringing forth, at least one of his critics said this was about obstetrics.
Obstetrics, yeah. They said this is kind of filthy language. It's kind of funny, yeah. And then other people said that, how dare he insult the Gettysburg dead by heaping such praise on people of color, because they assumed that when he was talking about that he was straightforwardly talking about the equality of African Americans with white people. So some of his critics really got on him for that. But he was really affirming, yes, human equality for people of all ethnicities and all religions. But for some people that was, offensive. It was offensive. Yeah,
yeah, that was offensive. But also all these years later, and even to people that heard it then, there's a certain appropriateness with America and the new frontier and the new continent for him to be talking about earthy reproductive topics. The founding fathers and Lady Liberty had a country. And it was
absolutely no, it was
to freedom.
It was very, someone who actually does become openly erotic, the poet Walt Whitman, who, by the way, loved Abraham Lincoln and wrote beautiful poetry about him. But he said he had the image of the poet as someone who literally makes love with the earth, but the American earth, the continent. And he used certain images that I wouldn't even rather repeat, but almost like the poet is literally conceiving by intersecting with kind of the physical America, and in a way, and the way Lincoln ends up the Gettysburg Address, shall not perish from the earth, at the end there, that again, back to the earth, even at the very end.
Yeah, begins with born, ends with shall not perish.
Yeah, exactly. Such a wonderfully and beautifully constructed speech, of course. And anytime you read it, I think I always get the tingles. I sincerely do, even though I've read it maybe 1,000 times, really. But yeah.
And well, as I mentioned before we started, I was talking, for the folks at home, I was talking with David and said, we're not going to try to talk about the whole book because it's got a Hastings number of pages in it, 1066. And you're really going to have to buy this book to read it and understand, I think as David said at the beginning, the tapestry. And one thing that I want folks that are considering buying a fat book to know is that he has succeeded, as he said, in weaving Lincoln into a story that just turns and turns and turns the pages. So you can go from topic to topic, whether it be this topic or that topic, Gettysburg Address, and Lincoln just flows right through it. And it's a great read. And I'm not going to say you're going to read it overnight. You're probably going to read it for a long time, but you are going to enjoy it. It's not an academic book. Maybe you did intend it for the Academy, I don't know, but yeah, it reads as a really wonderful story, as I think even scholarly works should.
Well, thank you. And when I wrote it, I really wrote it for the general reader, people who appreciate Lincoln, but also people who appreciate American history and Civil War history and biography. Mm-hmm. And life stories. So yeah, absolutely.
Now, with that in mind, I'm going to leap into what might seem to be a random topic, but that's how we're going to talk about the book today. We can't get through the whole thing. But Lincoln and the theater. I am a great lover of the theater. I studied it when I was younger. I've done acting. I've been in Shakespeare plays. And so anybody that wants to write about Lincoln and Shakespeare, I want to read it. And I want to read it carefully, and you can't get deep enough into the topic for me. But why don't you just start with, describe to us Lincoln's appreciation of the Bard.
Sure. Shakespeare was, I would say, probably his very favorite author. Although he loved Robert Burns, he loved several authors. But Shakespeare really talked to his very deepest feelings. And the beauty of Shakespeare, the reason that Lincoln liked poetry, because most of Shakespeare's dramas are in poetic language, is that poetry was in a way the most channeled and organized, but also in a sense the most expressive and concentrated. Just as Gettysburg Address is very concentrated, so Shakespeare's lines are very concentrated. And Lincoln would read them, read his plays, and he would read them over and over again, and they would sink onto his hard disk. So at moments during his presidency, he would come out with a soliloquy from, let's say, Hamlet or King Lear or Macbeth, one of his favorites. And he would do this not to impress other people, although quite often other people were around, people that were officials that were close to him. He said it not to impress them, just because they happened to express his true feelings of that moment. And when at the very end of the war, the very day that Grant accepted the surrender of Robert E. Lee, April 9th, 1865, Lincoln was on a boat because he had been visiting Grant in Virginia and going up the Potomac to Washington. And the news came through and everything. He knew basically the war was fundamentally over at that point. And everybody around him just wanted to celebrate, and mission accomplished, or whatever we would, what I mean, a natural human being would do. But he said, I'd rather talk about Shakespeare and Longfellow. And he read passages about death, which sounds quite melancholy, but he was really thinking of the 750,000 people who had died in the Civil War. And yes, he was very, very happy that the war was over, but his thoughts were really, really going out to those people. And for him, on that particular day, Longfellow and Shakespeare really spoke to his true feelings, which is really kind of amazing. Yeah.
So there were specific times during the presidency when he would resort to Shakespeare for comfort or for counsel.
Yes. And after the Battle of the Wilderness in the spring of 1864, it was a very, very grueling, battle in Virginia. And he said, oh my God, 20,000 people wiped off the face of the earth. And then he comes out with um, I think it's from Macbeth, tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in its petty pace from day to day. And then it ends in, the world is full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. He felt at that moment really kind of down and depressed. And so a kind of darker passage from Shakespeare at that particular moment expressed his feelings, which is not to say that he didn't like Shakespearean comedy, because he did, but he seemed to have a real inkling for the more tragic vision of Shakespeare and the way Shakespeare expressed that.
Right. Now, as a student of theater, one of the things that that I always loved, and I really loved it when I saw that Lincoln seemed to appreciate this all the way back then in his time. Now, the performance of Shakespeare and the reading of Shakespeare off the page, even now, are different things. But in 1860, they were two vastly different things. What you would see if you went to the theater was totally different than what you would see if you picked up a book. And so, with that in mind, thinking that's two different things, who were some of his favorite performers? Knowing
Right.
and what impressed him about them, the way they interpreted Shakespeare.
Right. Well, he was in touch with a guy named Hackett, who was who was excellent, particularly as Falstaff, one of the comic characters, but he was excellent. And and that's Hackett actually as Falstaff, and he was excellent at that. And actually, Lincoln, wrote. They had a kind of correspondence, because Lincoln was very interested in the way that theater was performed. He didn't just like the words, and he wrote about theatrical techniques and modes of acting to Hackett during his presidency. And one time when he was rather critical, and he went to Richard III, that he didn't think this didn't have anything to do with Hackett, but another actor. Frankly, Lincoln didn't think that he did a very good job, and he was talking to somebody else. He said, I wouldn't have acted that opening scene that way. I would have done it this way. And then he went through the opening scene, or the opening couple of pages, Richard III, the opening soliloquy. And he said, this is the way I think it really should be done. So yeah, I mean, it's incredible the way he was attentive, not just to the language, but to the performance. And when he memorized Robert Burns, he didn't just memorize Burns, he memorized it in the Scottish dialect. Mm-hmm. He wanted to capture that original dialect. So incredible sensitivity to, as you say, not only meaning, but also performance. Right. And sound.
And yeah, how it sounded. And he understood that Shakespeare was meant to be spoken.
Yes.
To be heard as well as read.
Absolutely. And back then, it's not like today, where frankly Shakespeare is more of an elite culture kind of figure or something like that, or you obediently read him in high school and college, and then you kind of maybe see an occasional Shakespeare play or something.
You have to pay a lot of money and you have to dress up.
Yeah, get all dressed up and all that. No. Back then, Shakespeare was really very, very popular and among the masses, which is why actually, someone like Booth was a pretty good Shakespearean actor, but he was always over the top in his Shakespearean performances. And he got criticized for that a little bit. His father was even more that way, but Junius Booth but John Wilkes Booth, when he got in a sword fight, really took it to the limit. And once the guy that he was having a fight with had to whisper, "John, die, will you die, please die?" And John said,
die.
Yeah. And another time he actually shoved, accidentally, I think, the opponent off the stage. But I mean, so there was this kind of, Melville distinguishes between two people back then in their views of Shakespeare, the kind of blood and thunder Shakespeare, because there's a lot of that in Shakespeare. There are sword fights, there are murders, there's stranglings and suffocation. There's a lot of that. And Melville said there are a lot of people who just go to the theater to see that. But then there are certain people for whom Shakespeare really strikes at what Melville called the very axis of reality, the deepest probings into human reality. And it's the latter vision that, frankly, Lincoln in the end responded to, whereas Booth was a real exponent of what I call the American style of acting, which was beyond method acting. I mean, it was really way beyond method acting. It was getting super involved in the role. But yeah.
Daniel, I see you've rejoined the conversation. It's good to see you.
The conversation about Shakespeare reminded me that I once handled a letter of his, Lincoln's, as member of Congress in 1848, where he was explaining someone wanted a lieutenancy in the Army, and he had to explain that the Mexican War was ending, a treaty was coming, that there would be no lieutenancy necessary anymore. And he explained it by saying, Othello's occupation's gone. So it's interesting that you say that the audience, the people of the nation, many of them would have understood that.
Yeah,
and the recipient probably would have understood that line. Now, I want to also say that Dave Bradley is watching from the UK. Thank you, Dave, for that. Dave Wiegers is on with us a little bit closer, just outside of Chicago. And we have a question from Jason in Portland, who, we just had on Bill Brand on his Zealot and the Emancipator, Lincoln v. Brown. And Jason says that, quotes a line from the book, he's read it, Lincoln had already established a cultural atmosphere friendly to the memory of John Brown. He asked that you perhaps expound on that.
Right. Was that from my book or from Brand's, from my book, I guess, right?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. Oh, well, I mean, John Brown, Lincoln and John Brown both hated slavery. They hated slavery as much as each other. But as I explained in my book, John Brown was caught up in the higher law. He wrote his own version of the Constitution, his own version of the Declaration of Independence. They were both very anti-slavery at a time when the Constitution was considered to be maybe pro-slavery in some of its passages. And then he broke the law to try to get rid of slavery. He broke the law. And when he did that in 1859, by raiding the South, invading the South in Harper's Ferry, and he had already murdered 5 pro-slavery people in Kansas, Lincoln backed off and just said, John Brown is very generous. We share his feelings about slavery, but he broke the law. Lincoln always wanted to stay within the Constitution as much as possible. But what happened during the Civil War, when he was elected, the South said, now the Oval Office is, or the White House is occupied by a vulgar partisan of John Brown. Now, Lincoln was not a vulgar partisan. He had never backed John Brown at all, but he had always tried to distance himself from John Brown. And in fact, at the beginning of the war, he said, a war just to end slavery would be nothing more than a John Brown raid on a gigantic scale. He actually said that, on a gigantic scale. He said, at that point, he was more interested in repairing the Union. However, what happened in the course of the war is that it increasingly became an anti-slavery war. Fundamentally, Lincoln did hate slavery. He wanted to get rid of it. And more slaves were being contraband. They were coming over to the northern armies. Then progressively, and then Lincoln passed the Emancipation Proclamation, and he witnessed the performance of African American troops, 180,000, without which he said he thought that the North might not have won the war. And he was really admiring the African American troops. So by 1864, he actually began to think about here was now a war to end slavery, basically, although he couldn't even talk about that as much directly as other people wanted to. But he met with Frederick Douglass in August 1864 and said, would you go down and be almost a scout and spread the word of emancipation among the slaves, kind of in the John Brown way? And because John Brown had wanted to infiltrate the South and create a series of events that would lead to emancipation. And it would become almost like John Brown's Underground Railroad, so to speak, or underground, or sort of telegraph, I think, John Brown, where the message would go amidst this, because a lot of the enslaved people, frankly, didn't know that the Emancipation Proclamation had been passed. So, and Douglass was stunned. He said, yeah, I mean, and Douglass had formerly felt rather wary, didn't think it was anti-slavery enough. He said, yeah, I'd be glad to. Then the tide of the war turned with Sherman and Grant and Farragut. So that obviated the necessity for Douglass to lead this band of scouts. But still, there was that kind of idea. And then when Lincoln meets with Martin Delany in February 1865, and this was after Congress had passed the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery, he said, I want to, he made Delany, an African-American, the highest ranking African-American officer, and I would like you to lead a kind of an army of liberation, because the end was not quite yet in sight. And he really wanted Delany to lead a group of African-American soldiers down there. And he said almost like on a John Brown style, because John Brown had led African-Americans into the South. And so John Brown came up again. So that's the way that he begins, on the one hand, very much, at least publicly, against John Brown. And then finally, when it becomes a violent anti-slavery war, he brings in African-Americans like Douglass and Delany, and John Brown is brought up at that point. Yeah.
I know, Bjorn, you have a bunch of questions left,
Sure.
and I don't want to stay on the same thing, but two people have talked about theater, and one with a comment and one with a question.
Sure.
Steve from Madison, Georgia. We also have Sheila from Macon, Georgia watching, but Steve said that he had ordered the book from us. Thank you, Steve. And he asking about, he loved the tactile nature of the book, but he likes the audible version as well. And did you have anything to do with selecting the narrator, Leon Nixon? His reading is very theatrical. And at the same time, it was asked by Samuel in Dayton, how do you think Lincoln would have viewed his own theatrical assassination?
Yeah, they're both great questions.
Just in brief, if you could say
yeah, for sure. For all my audiobooks, the publisher will send me various voices of people, of voice actors. And I chose Leon Nixon over, I think, about 5 others. It's kind of interesting. He used to be a police chief in Los Angeles, and then he became a voice actor. I found that his voice was just very both clear and also kind of moving without being overly theatrical. I think that Nixon gets in a lot of emotion, but without becoming kind of hammy, like sort of like overly so. And I felt a kind of engagement in his voice with the text that he was reading. So I'm very, very happy. I've gotten a lot of positive feedback, from the Audible. The other thing, well, in a way, how would Lincoln feel about dying in the theater? I hate to say it, but he loved going to the theater. And maybe some of us have a favorite chair that we would relaxing watching our favorite sports event or something. And I mean, if he were going to, he was watching a very frothy comedy, and the actor had just used a weird word, sockdologizing. You sockdologizing old woman and that kind of thing. And he loved that kind of word. I hate to say that he'd be happy, but again, if we're going to die somewhere, we might as well die where it's kind of fun for us. I can just see him kind of smiling there, maybe nodding off a little bit, but it's kind of with a smile on his face. I hate to say that about someone's assassination.
Thank you. Back to you, Bjorn.
All right, thank you, Daniel, and thank you for everybody who commented. Continue to comment, continue to ask questions, because Daniel might pop back in and share your questions again. And David, I want to pick up on the last thing you were saying here, because it just occurred to me when you described the assassination, the last thing Lincoln did was laugh.
Yeah.
That was the last thing he did.
Right.
And so Lincoln, humor, humbug, and all this tragedy, that was always part of his character, and that was always part of the culture that he loved. And so removing assassination from the topic, who were some of his favorite humorists, and how did he encounter them? Did he read them? Did he see them? Did he go to lectures? I don't know.
Sure. Well, he loved Robert Henry Newell, who was his pseudonym was Orpheus C. Kerr, which is a pun on office seeker, because Lincoln was hounded by office seekers. And so Orpheus C. Kerr, Kerr, who was a very popular humorist of the day and treated a lot of very serious Civil War topics in a very funny kind of way, almost like late night humor today or something like that, taking kind of serious issues and not necessarily being that partisan, sometimes being partisan, but not that. I mean, he made a lot of fun of the Confederates and the Cavaliers and all of that stuff. But he would also sometimes make fun of the abolitionists, and even Lincoln a little bit. But Lincoln loved him, and loved Petroleum Nasby, whose real name was David Ross Locke, but Petroleum Vesuvius Nasby. There's Nasby.
There he is. I love Nasby.
Yeah, oh yeah. No, he's hilarious. He now Nasby. The story behind Nasby is that David Ross Locke was an abolitionist. He was a journalist who loved Lincoln, loved him. And he went to the Lincoln-Douglas debates. He detested Stephen Douglas. He loved Lincoln. But during the Civil War, and he met Lincoln because he followed Lincoln around during the Lincoln-Douglas debates. And Lincoln took off his shoes and kind of leaned back, almost like Nasby did here. And they kind of joked a lot. But, and they kind of both made fun of Stephen Douglas. But this was during the war. This is not a picture of Locke. This is a picture of his persona, Nasby.
Right.
During the war, Locke impersonated a very vulgar, drunken, and extremely racist Copperhead. Copperheads were the Democratic opponents of Lincoln in the North. And Nasby really went to town impersonating them, using the N-word left and right, but the N-word not to be approved of, but to be very repulsive, because he wanted to present in a very bald way the utter racism of these peace Democrats in the North, the Copperheads. And he was so popular that some people actually said that there were three reasons for the North's victory: Sherman, Grant, and the Nasby papers. Sherman, Grant, and the Nasby papers. And several people said that kind of thing. And Lincoln carried Nasby around with him, the pamphlets of Nasby, the works by Nasby around with him. And he also regularly read Orpheus C. Kerr,
Yeah.
very regularly. He memorized a lot of their sketches and would burst out every once in a while. And once he said, if I could write like that guy Nasby, Locke, I would give up he was kind of joking, but I would give up my office and just go to Ohio and sit there and write.
Right. But
Yeah.
also, Locke, I don't know how deep this gets into your book, but he sort of, to throw back into the theater aphorism is satire closes on Saturday. That's often said. Mm-hmm. And Locke paid a bit of a penalty for creating this really vile character. And he found points where he had to go, whoa, I'm not Nasby. In fact, this is a caricature of a person I hate.
Yeah, and it's funny, when I first encountered Nasby in the newspapers, because I read a lot of the old newspapers, I said, this guy is really, really disgusting. And then I suddenly realized, oh, he's supposed to be disgusting. And I said, oh, this is the same guy that Lincoln loved because he's utterly disgusting. And in a way, it's like beyond Saturday Night Live or whatever, beyond a lot of these late night shows of political satire. It's very, very caustic, extremely caustic. And he even congratulated Booth for killing Lincoln, because Nasby, as a copperhead, always talked about killing Lincoln and everything. Now, mind you, Locke loved Lincoln, loved him, thought he was like Jesus Christ or something like that. But as Nasby, he was just impersonating the opposition.
Right. Yeah. Now, you had mentioned both Orpheus C. Kerr and Locke, and I just want to let people know, and this is part of what we're doing, we are selling your book and we want them to order it, but also Abraham Lincoln Bookshop is an antiquarian bookshop dedicated to Abraham Lincoln, the Civil War, the presidency, and we are a place where everything we have is a cultural artifact. Everything that David writes about is stuff. It started as stuff, people created it for some reason. And as an example, here I can share with you a set of first edition copies of Orpheus C. Kerr papers. And these are the kind of things you can get here at Abraham Lincoln Bookshop. I happen to have our Orpheus C. Kerr papers come in this beautiful slipcase.
And they're a lot of fun to read. I've read all through them.
Right.
A lot of fun. They give you a real funny, humor-tinged picture of this Civil War that's not usually thought of that way. Yeah.
Now, I want to leap to another different author now. And it won't surprise you, David, that we're not even going to get close to everything that I wanted to talk about within the hour. But that's fine. That's why we're here. And that's why you're going to want the folks at home are going to buy the book and read it to see exactly the scope and the scale of what you deal with. But I want to jump to another author, Orpheus C. Kerr, Petroleum Nasby, Harriet Beecher Stowe. She plays a huge part in Lincoln's anti-slavery thinking. And we don't necessarily need Abraham Lincoln to say, you're the little lady who started this great big war, or wave Stowe around and say, hey, everybody, I read Uncle Tom's Cabin. Everybody read Uncle Tom's Cabin. And they either hated it or they loved it. And so how does Stowe and how does Uncle Tom's Cabin interact with Lincoln and the development of his anti-slavery views, his anti-slavery language, 1852?
Yeah, well, Uncle Tom's Cabin is an instant bestseller worldwide. In the first year. It sold about 1.5 million copies. And what happens in 1852 when that comes out is that Harriet Beecher Stowe in that novel, for the first time, very realistically portrays enslaved people as truly human. Um, uh, just like anybody else, they can laugh, they can sing, they can feel pain, they suffer a lot, they have families, they have children. Um, and this was very much against the Southern view, which basically treated um, enslaved people as property, as things. And she was going to call her novel, subtitle it, "The Man That Was a Thing," as an ironic subtitle. And Frederick Douglass would go around and, as a lecturer in the North, and say, he would open his chest and he said, "Here's the thing from the South." And she's the first person who, on a mass level, showed that enslaved people were not, and African Americans are not things. They're not, and they're not animals. But 2 years later, Lincoln, for the first time publicly, really emphasizes at Peoria, his speech at Peoria in 1854, says several things. "I've always hated slavery as much as abolitionists." And he said, slave owners think that they confuse the enslaved people with animals, with hogs, with cattle. They're not. They're living human beings. And what had happened is that the entire culture, and Stowe was not alone. She was the most famous, but there were a lot of slave narratives by Frederick Douglass and other people. The whole culture suddenly was aware, much more aware, in the North at least, of the sheer humanity of enslaved people. And so for the first time at Peoria, Lincoln, he had always hated slavery, but for the first time he kind of verbalizes it in public. And then later on, someone comes to his home in Springfield, and there's a very well-worn copy of Uncle Tom's Cabin. Do we know for sure that he read it when it first came out in 1850? No, we don't know, but we do know that his law partner, William Herndon, with whom he was every working day of the week, he was with Herndon. He had a copy of it, and later Lincoln said, "I know all about the Beecher family, the anti-slavery Beecher," and he held up this copy of Uncle Tom's Cabin. And during the presidency, he checked out of the library The Key to Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe, which explains all the characters and everything. So yeah.
Right. So she was important to him. Now we're going to run out of time. We're quickly running out of time. So, but I want to ask one more question, give you a chance to talk about this. And this may be a quality of cultural history or a quality of cultural biography, and I want to give you a chance to talk about it. Let's imagine, in terms of anti-slavery thinking, let's imagine Lincoln in Lexington at the time that he had gone back to Lexington to litigate this trial for the Todds. So you paint a picture of the Lexington that Lincoln is in during that stay and what's going on. And you do not need Lincoln to go, "I saw this, I saw that, I thought this about this, I thought that about that." You paint a picture of the city he is in during the time when he's living in Lexington. And it's vivid and it's distressing. And if you don't do that, you don't understand what Lincoln was seeing during that visit to Lexington. Can you expound on that a little bit?
Yeah, well, he was down there on a lawsuit. I'm not going to get into the lawsuit. It was something to do with the Todd family, his wife's family, and inheritance and that kind of thing. He was there for a few weeks, and he was staying in one of the relatives, and the relative's home was right across from a building in which they held enslaved people in cages, and they would stuff them in there, really like animals. And next to that, and a lot of these people were infirm people, or they were older people that they would try to kind of make look better than they were, and then sell them for much much more than they were, quote, worth or whatever in that day. It was a very cruel situation. And they were living among vermin, and it was in these stinking cages. And then next to that, there was a place where um, enslaved women were utilized as fancy girls, as for sexual reasons. And then when he went to the courthouse, there was a tree with 3 branches where they would chain enslaved people with their arms outspread and whip them if they did any little infraction, such as staying out after curfew. There was like a 7 o'clock curfew in Lexington. So does he ever really talk about it in his letters? No, but we know he was there. We know he was a very observant person. And this kind of thing really would have disgusted him totally.
He can't have
Appalled
missed
him.
it. What he
Appalled
did
him.
tell us. Go ahead.
Yeah, totally appalled him. He would have been appalled. Yeah.
And he did tell us that he hated slavery as long as he could remember.
That's right.
And then he had to see this.
That's right. That's right.
Daniel, what do you got for us?
Well, we've gotten to the end of our time, I think, and we haven't had any other questions at the moment, but I think you've covered quite a bit, and I hope those of you who are watching will maybe leave comments and questions. Maybe, David, you might even come back to it and answer some of them for our people,
Sure.
our viewers. So I want to thank Bjorn very much for his getting this interview together. It's
kidding.
and you didn't scratch the surface of this book.
No. Dan, I'm going to take a minute from you just so that I can sort of read off some of the things that we didn't talk about.
Okay, yeah.
Some of them, but we didn't talk about. We talked a little bit about Walt Whitman. We hardly touched on Herman Melville and what people thought about novelists and how novelists. We hardly talked about Mary Lincoln and her interaction with American culture and the way she saw it. A huge part of what you talk about is also what a lot of historians are writing about today, the culture of death and mourning. And you talk about that, but it's all in there. As you say, you weave it into the tapestry. And I thank you for doing that. I think you've done it brilliantly. And I think everybody needs to, especially coming up with the holidays, everybody needs to get a copy. Currently, we have first edition copies of Abe Lincoln in His Times, signed on a custom book plate. I think Dan's reaching for one right now himself. Now, we have a couple shows coming up very quickly. I'm just going to let you know about 2 of them. On December 1st, Elizabeth Mitchell will be here. David, she's a neighbor of yours. I imagine anybody that lives in New York City hangs out together in the same coffee shop about Abraham Lincoln. But Elizabeth Mitchell will, let me get my page out here. Elizabeth Mitchell will be with us on December 1st at 3:30 to talk about Lincoln's Lies, the true Civil War caper through fake news, Wall Street, and the White House. I think you folks at home are going to love this, and it touches on that one episode of Lincoln shutting down a newspaper for fake news. And she expounds on that and moves it into a really entertaining, readable, full-length book. On the 14th of January, 2021, we are starting our 2021 season, Dan. We will be here with Benjamin T. Harrington, the last Lincoln Republican. That's the presidential election of 1880. And that is James A. Garfield and Winfield Scott Hancock, 2 Union generals that they couldn't fight the Confederates anymore, so they decided to fight each other. And so, David, thank you again for joining us. And I'll let Dan.
Great, Bjorn and Daniel. It's been wonderful, and it'd be great, if everyone could buy their book from your bookshop. It'd be just great.
Your mouth to God's ears.
Yeah. Thanks for your great questions and for the questions of the viewers as well.
Well, if you've enjoyed this interview or watching afterward on YouTube, you can get even more enjoyment by ordering this book. You'll get a first edition while we have them, and with this wonderful signed book attached inside that David himself signed. It's not an auto pen and not a secretarial. This is authentic. And you will receive your book with that. If you wish to know more about our future interviews, please leave us your email and see our historical artifacts on our website at alincolnbookshop.com. You might also like our other show, Take a Break with History. We have one actually tomorrow at 1 p.m. Central Time. I'm going to talk about the great collector, Oliver Barrett, who lived here in Chicago, and Sandberg, who writes on him, also wrote his Prairiers, really from Barrett's own collection. So, thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time on A House Divided.